Hey, welcome back to Ruby Rogues. This week on our panel, we have Valentino Stoll.
Hey now.
I'm Charles Max Wood from Top End Devs. And this week we have a special guest. That is Alex Evanczuk. I hope I said that right.
You got it.
Yeah, with all the technical difficulties, I'm like, oh, I forgot what he said. Anyway, do you want to tell people real quick why you're famous and exciting to talk to?
Sure, yeah. So not so much sure about famous and exciting, but I'm Alex and I work on the product infrastructure team at Gusto, which we call ourselves the all-in-one people platform. Gusto offers payroll, benefits, HR, a bunch of other stuff to small and large businesses. And at Gusto, I work on a lot of different product infrastructure kind of things, but my main focus for the past 2 years or so has been around product modularization.
Nice. I think that kind of ties into what we're talking about today because we ran across your article. Came out in January. It says a how-to guide for Ruby packs, Gusto's gem ecosystem for modularizing Ruby applications. And I started looking through this, and because I was like, Ruby packs. I hadn't really heard of Ruby packs, and maybe this is something that I just haven't had the opportunity to use. I don't know if it's a well-established thing out there that I didn't see, but it looks like it's just a gem that includes a bunch of functionality. Why don't you just tell me what I got wrong as far as what it is? Like, what is a pack and what
Sure.
do you use it for?
Yeah. No, nothing you got wrong. Packs are a new concept. It's something that Gusto and myself are trying to not necessarily popularize. I don't necessarily care if it's popular per se, but we want to try to solve problems around Ruby modularization. And just to back up for a second, a lot of us are familiar with GEMS, which is the Ruby community's solution for packaging and distributing Ruby code. The thing with GEMS is that in order for something to be a gem, it has to have technically perfect boundaries. And by that, I mean, you have to be very strict about your dependencies. You can only reference things that are within your gem or within your dependencies. Now, this is where it made it really hard to use gems in an existing application, such as Gusto's. Gusto's application was this big entangled monolith with aspirational boundaries. We had a lot of things we thought should be maybe in a gem here or there, but it was all entangled like any real organic system. So packs are kind of like a lightweight gem to do something that we call gradual modularization. You can basically put things in a pack and then use this other ecosystem of tools to to kind of give you a template, to kind of give you some guidance to arrive at those boundaries within the code base.
Okay, so I'm kind of imagining a couple of different ways this could go, right? And on your blog post, it looked like you might get like a pack around different functionality that all kind of live in the same place. Like there's a RuboCop pack, right? So it includes extra cops and stuff like that for RuboCop that make it do stuff or things like that. But the way you described it, it almost sounded like you also might be packaging up your own code, for a lack of a better way to put it, and creating the boundaries that way. So is it one, the other, or both?
Yeah. So we tend to think of packs first and foremost as a way of drawing domain boundaries around product and business domains. So, for example, if you have a large application, for example, at Gusto, we need to pay people through payroll. So and of course, this is all kind of oversimplified, but the idea is we might have a payroll pack and a payments pack. And a company like Gusto, when you're first starting, payments and payroll may be inextricably sort of coupled. The only time we're paying people is through payroll. But as our software system grows, we find other places we want to, pay people in other ways. So we want to start to decouple these systems. And to do that, we start to create these packs and solidify and improve the boundaries between them.
I gotcha. For our book club in January, we read Clean Architecture, and Uncle Bob talks about the idea of components, and it's kind of the same idea, right? And then, of course, he gives you permission as your app evolves, and you kind of brought this up, right, to find some of those other boundaries, right? Where, yeah, initially you only had one thing calling the other thing, and so they were more or less just one thing, right? Because it was just one set of functionality. But yeah, now I've got 2 or 3 or 4 other components that rely on this subset of this one component, so you break it off into another component, and that's effectively what you're doing with packs.
Yeah, and when I think about breaking up an application, think about modularizing an application, we're not necessarily doing it for its own sake.
Right.
Clean architecture, the intent of having a good, well modularized architecture is for some business purpose, whether that be to enable other product optionality. We want to pay people in other ways. Maybe it's because there are regulatory or compliance reasons. Maybe it's the code is very confusing and we need to debug it in isolation.
It's just maintainability. Yeah,
exactly. So yeah, and I want to kind of get to the nuts and bolts of packs. A pack, all it is in its bare bones representation is a folder of code. It's just a folder with a bunch of Ruby files in it and other files too. And it has a package YAML at the root of that folder. And it doesn't have a bunch of runtime components that change much. It's really just about moving code to different places and then using static analysis tools such as packwork to figure out what the boundaries are and the relationships are between those packs and between those parts of the system.
Yeah, I've got a lot of questions. My first one is, I guess, mostly around how is this different than like Rails engines, and what made you decide to go in a different direction? I have a feeling that it's more of the shared aspects of this, and I guess that's my follow-up is like, kind of, what advantages do you get out of this new packs? Portion? Is it specifically to reuse pieces in the modularization, or is it mostly just having the domain knowledge separated?
So, Rails engines are great solutions to modularization as well. And that's what Gusto started with throughout this whole journey to decompose our monolith. We said, Rails engines, they are the way. And what we found was a couple things. For net new projects, Rails engines worked pretty well for us. They let us put all of our code into one place, keep it isolated. But what if we have an existing big system and we wanted to pull things into a Rails engine? We might think, we try to pull one file in and run the test in that Rails engine and realize that Rails engine depends on a lot of other parts of the system. And as you pull that string, it starts to pull on the entire application, because a lot of large Rails applications may be sort of cyclical in nature. The dependency structure, everything kind of depends on everything. So Rails engines are tough because they don't have this quality of allowing you to adopt them gradually. Whereas with packs, you can start to put everything in a pack. And even without those imperfect boundaries, you can use packwork and it'll tell you, hey, you say this thing is in a pack and it doesn't depend on these other packs, but actually here are all the relationships that need to be worked out before you can make this an engine. So I like to kind of think of it as potentially a path that can get you there to an engine. And one other thing I want to add was, sometimes if you're working in a Rails engine, you may want to call to an existing system that is not yet an engine. Say you have a Slack notifier within your application, and you need to hit your Slack API to post an important message about the business. Well, the way to do that with Rails engines is either pull that Slack notifier into a Rails engine or a gem itself, or to perhaps use dependency injection to pass that into the Rails engine in some way. But with packs, what's nice is that even if you have those perfect boundaries, you can iterate really quickly and perhaps reach outside of that and, provide that business value and come back to architectural or structural improvements when the time permits.
That makes sense. One other thing that I'm thinking of is that, and I guess it's a trivial thing because you can just figure it out, but Rails engines also, you usually mount them under a specific route, and so you would actually have to change your routing and anything that depended one way or the other. But yeah, I was going to ask the exact same question because I was thinking the same thing. If I need to modularize my Rails app, why can't I just put them under engines and then just surface it all, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's always worth trying. I think that trying it is what gave us the experience to realize it ends up being really, really challenging. Because if you think about how a gem works, and a Rails engine is just a gem that connects to Rails through rail ties and other things like that. Well, bundler requires that all of the dependencies within a gem's dependency tree are acyclic. So that means that in order to extract something into a gem, you basically you have to start from the leaf nodes. You have to start from the things that depend on nothing, pull that into the Rails engine, and then incrementally, detangle things until it can fit into the technical requirements of a Rails engine. Now that's a great process. It might lead to really great code with great boundaries, but it'll force you to potentially go on a sort of a wild goose chase of detangling things that are not necessarily connected to the types of business value that you want to produce.
Yeah. Clean architecture also points out some of the dangers of those cyclical relationships, both from your entities or classes as well as your components. And so it's an interesting conversation to have as to whether or not, having to untangle those things that way may or may not make your code more easy to reason about or things like that. But at the same time, you are forcing a boundary here, and that's one thing that's nice, is because then you can isolate the system from things that it doesn't need to know about, and you can run those packs on their own, and that's actually a really nice thing, because then if it's a payments pack, all I care about is whether or not it'll put the payments through, right? Is it making the right API calls across the internet? Is it using the right abstraction layer that I put over the top of that in case the API changes, right? And does it translate the items in my system correctly to go to the other system? Does it, when it receives a response, does it do the right thing? And I don't have to worry about, does the payroll system blah, 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 right? Because the payroll system is in a different pack and it's a different concern. And then on the other side, on the payroll system, all I really have to do is double check that it's meeting the contract with the payment system on the other end. And so it keeps it relatively simple. So I guess the question is, then what do the packs do, right? How do the packs resolve some of these cyclical dependencies or some of these other issues that you're bringing up with Rails engines that are going to be painful when I try it?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'll do my best to try to answer it. So the way that I would recommend an org think about this and go about it is first to just think about their key domains and their mental model for how those domains relate. In the case of Gusto, we might say, hey, payroll depends on payments. Payments doesn't depend on payroll, but payments may rely on a Slack utility, a feature flags utility, authorization utility, and so on. And then we create those packs. We say, okay, here's a folder of code called payroll. Here's payments, and so on. And then we move the code into those packs. And what's we then do is use this tool called Packwork, which was open sourced by Shopify. And what Packwork does is that it'll basically read through all of the pack nodes and create edges between those pack nodes that based on references to Ruby constants. So it might say, oh, I see that payments depends on payroll here. And what it does is that you can specify the dependencies between packs within the package YAML file. So you say, okay, dependencies for payroll, dependencies are payments and feature flags and so on. And then what Packwork does is it basically takes a diff between the graph that you've declared about how your system should be modeled and the actual graph as it relates to the code base. And that diff basically represents the delta of effort needed to, I guess, actualize the architecture that you're describing.
I'm not sure I completely followed that.
Sure, yeah. So
it might just be my brain going.
No, I don't.
It's a different idea than what I've done in the past.
Yeah, it definitely took me a long time to think about it. At first, when I first thought about all this, I first heard about Packwork, I thought, I don't know, I don't get it. We have engines, we have gems.
Right.
Ruby has a private constant feature. Why can't I use those? And we certainly can use those. There's still a tool in our tool belt. But what I really liked was when I reflected back to various times that I tried to extract something into an engine, what I found was that I had a mental model for the final state of that engine. All the APIs that it would expose, what it would depend on, what it wouldn't depend on, et cetera. But that final state that I had to be represented, I guess, in a document, in some documentation I wrote, and sort of tribal knowledge somewhere. And there wasn't a way that I could follow some sort of template to allow me to get to that stage. So what's really cool about Packwork and this idea of packs is that you can basically describe the final state of your system. You can put things into a pack and say, this is what I would like it to depend on. And these are the APIs that I want to expose. And then what Packwork will do is it'll say, here are all the places that you have violated your stated dependencies. Here are all the places where things are using private API. So now that process of trying to go from entangled to componentized or modularized, that becomes a sort of a mechanized process where you can follow a to-do, basically produces a to-do list where it says, hey, if you do everything on this to-do list, you'll be able to turn this into a Rails engine. I'm not sure if that added any clarity. Still trying to work on my pitch a little bit.
So it sounds like this is like an elaborate dependency manager.
Yeah, maybe. I mean,
in a way, I mean, it does more building than anything, I think, from what you were saying. But I'm super curious about the static analysis portion of this. I know that's just kind of like a tool of working with Packwork. Because for the longest time I've wanted to have like the ability to not just require the entire, Rails ecosystem with every file, right? And I know there was a while ago with somebody from Stripe that was working on their own loader to load individual files and be able to do some static analysis to also not do that. How are you guys working with that? And do you have it? Like, can you use Packwork in that way where it works with an autoloader or something to handle that resolution?
So let's see. I think I understand what you're asking. So the one way that we've used this toolchain is once you start describing the dependencies between these packs, when you run tests, you can use the dependency graph and use sort of first principles about dependency graphs to know how one change could affect other parts of that dependency graph. When you change Rails, your application might break, but when you change your application, Rails itself is not going to break for everyone else just because of what depends on what. Mm-hmm. So we have this feature called conditional builds, where when someone pushes to CI with a change, it will only run tests for the portions of the application that depend on the thing being changed. So that's kind of one way that you can build tooling on top of the dependency graph. In terms of loading, we don't yet segment or manipulate how Zeitwerk will auto load or eagerly load portions of the application. It's certainly a dream of ours, is that we can use this ecosystem to effectively, there's this whole debate with microservices versus monolith, and usually that's the first decision that someone makes. They say, okay, I want this to be in the monolith, or I want this to be in a microservice. And what we hope is that by using this sort of tool chain, someday we can get to a point where once you've effectively modularized enough of the dependencies of your system, the tool chain itself can pick up on the fact that something can be deployed as a separate application and do that programmatically. That's just kind of the North Star vision at the moment.
So I guess the next question that I have is, at what point does it start making sense to modularize, right? I mean, it sounds like a solution to a problem that I may not have.
Definitely. Awesome question. And we don't necessarily want to modularize just to modularize, because, we live in a world of constraints, and, businesses only have so much money to work on certain things. There might not be a point. So we modularize because it makes sense, because maybe it enables new product options. Maybe it reduces duplicate work. Maybe instead of everyone rebuilding their own, Slack notifier, you modularize a little Slack notifier. Maybe you're doing it because the complexity is too high and you need to be able to think about certain components in isolation. On the flip side, there's definitely a lot of times you don't need to modularize. Perhaps every time you modularize, it creates indirection between something. Having payroll and payments coupled as one means that you don't have to make that jump of thinking about how these kind of going through these different interfaces. It's sort of one concept. Maybe there's just other bigger fish to fry. Maybe a system is working. Why change it? And there are other business opportunities. So it really comes down to what are the needs of the business, and do the promises of modularization, do the folks who are on the ground and have all spoke with one another, do they agree that it'll help solve the problem?
Right. So it sounds like you have to have a conversation about it. You have to talk to the people who are involved, the stakeholders, and figure
Definitely.
it out. There's not a hard and fast rule.
No, and if anyone feels like they have found a rule, I would definitely love to hear it, because I've still been trying to answer this question and provide some sort of guidance on it. But I think it's a time when you could really trust the ICs, our individual contributors, as we call them. The folks who are making the changes to their system, they are often the ones who are the best equipped to say, hey, this system is too hard to change. Everything is too coupled, and I can't break my change set down into, small pieces. Or, I keep rebuilding the same thing. We should extract this thing. So, I don't think that kind of passing down guidance from, top down necessarily makes sense, but empowering people to have that opportunity, that if they think that spending time on structural improvements is worth their time, I think it's enough to just encourage them and to give them that space and to give them the mentorship to do that work.
Talking about the process, one thing I always find myself doing anytime I find kind of the domain boundaries starting to get blended with, things that shouldn't be blended, right? Is start breaking it out into its own like section in the code base, right? With just straight up namespacing and trying to tackle the problem just from a namespace perspective. So, I mean, if you think about like your transition with Packwork, like at what point in that like setting up just namespace boundaries are you like, okay, this kind of really belongs in its own pack? Like, where does that blend start? Like, where you're like, okay, it's ready. Like, it really, are there deciding factors for you where you're like, definitely should be its own pack versus the namespace is fine?
Yeah, so I would say short answer no, as far as a hard guideline. I found with all of this work is that there are very rarely hard and fast rules. That being said, one thing I do want to mention is one of the tools in this ecosystem, Rubocop Packs, has a Rubocop for namespace enforcements. So if you turn it on for a pack, it'll basically enforce that everything in that pack is under a single global namespace. Because one of the things that we found was that in our large Rails application is we just had so much pollution in the global namespace. And not only was that tough for collisions and things like that, but also trying to create a bounded context, as some folks in the industry refer to it as, this like surrounding around piece of the code. But yeah, in terms of like when to put something in its own pack, I'm not sure. One of the things that we really like about packs is that the overhead for a pack is very low. And this is something that's, I think, a little bit different compared to a gem. Sometimes, with a gem, there's sometimes quite a bit of boilerplate, especially for an engine. But what's nice with a pack is the overhead is so low to put something in its own pack. So you can make something that's a single file, with a single little helpful utility, or a huge subservice can be its own pack. And I think it really comes down to if I keep thinking that one part of a pack is totally unrelated to its neighbors within that pack, and my mental model is that there's a really well-defined relationship between separate components of the pack, then I might break that up.
So I'm curious too then, because I'm trying to imagine, using packs and like where kind of like where all of the features really start to shine, right?
Sure.
So what about like working with these smaller, more modular pieces of it, like way outperform, or the benefits are just so much better than working with like a strict namespace or gems or engines or something like that, that are just so clear, right? Like where you're like, oh yeah, well we wouldn't use anything else.
Yeah, it's a good question, and one thing I should say is that the tool is, a lot of the value from the tool comes in how it's used. Are we drawing the right boundaries? And I think that if you're using a tool and the boundaries, domain boundaries aren't great, then someone might not get a lot of value from the tool. But it's we actually found value in it right from the start. The very first thing we did was we had ownership of code. We have this, one of the tools in this tool chain is called code ownership. So we had all the code in our system owned by a team. So the first thing we did, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but we moved the code into packs based on the team who owned the code. And that was sort of intentionally bad. You don't want to divide code based on organizational boundaries, but it started to push folks to think about, okay, what are the domain model for the code that I own? Whereas if you think about traditional Rails applications, all of the models are in one place. All of the controllers are in one place. But that means that when you're starting to work on a feature, you're jumping across these architectural layers your diff isn't really co-located. The diff that you make is spread across the whole code base. So we noticed basically immediately was that our diffs tended to be more isolated. It was like, hey, I'm working within one place of the code base. But yeah, other than that, I'm not sure if that answered your question.
Yeah, I think it's starting to make more sense.
Yeah, I mean, for me, what you're talking about here with this is, it's easier to keep track of changes. It's easier to manage those parts of the code base on their own, test them on their own. And then, you just manage the boundary as far as how everything else connects to it. And so as long as you're explicit about, how things talk to it and how it talks to other things, then it becomes a lot simpler because the things you're doing now only affect this small part of the code. Or at least that ideally.
Yeah, one way I think about it is, in a really large system, we want to be able to make changes at a really large scale, in order to have a lot of leverage as an organization. The problem is if you have in order to make large changes, you kind of need to have some sort of pattern at scale, some sort of structure at scale where you can back up and say, okay, this is how the system is intended to be laid out. This depends on that. This depends on that. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where sometimes the most value comes in, because what we found with gems and engines is that it's really hard to use. I mean, they're great tools if you can get there and if you start in an engine. And of course, it's necessary if you want to distribute and publish your library. But using what we call unbuilt components, where you have a gem just within your application, it becomes it's really hard to take a large entangled application and divide it into gems that have, an acyclic dependency graph. Ends up being just an incredibly challenging technical problem. On the other hand, with packs and with pack work, arriving at that whole mental model where everything is in a pack, everything is in sort of a modularized folder, is considerably easier. And it lets you sort of bypass things that are incredible technical challenges that have relatively low value. And that's what we found sometimes with engines, is that it forces you to attempt to solve really, really hard technical challenges in your system just to reach a technical ideal of it being in an engine. But that it may not actually have a lot of business value to solve that problem. So what we're left with pack work is that we may say, hey, this depends on this, but actually there are what pack work calls violations to that. There are places where the system doesn't actually respect the stated boundaries. But then the beauty is you have the freedom to choose whether or not to invest in that structural change. You can say, hey, it's worth the cost to better modularize that reference, to decouple something or to invert a dependency or so on. Or you can leave it be and move on to other things. It kind of gives you a lot of freedom to tackle the problem from different angles rather than the angles that extracting to a Rails engine forces you in.
Right.
So I'm curious I'm curious what level of modularization we're talking, right? Because let's say one of the biggest problems with a giant Rails monolith starts to become the user model, right? Or accounts or something like
definitely.
that. Right, where it's yes. The most requested and used dependency in the app and all the apps related to it, right? How do you start sharing something like that within packs, right? How does that it's not really top down, right, at this point because it's becoming modular. How do you start sharing these key pieces like a user model or something like this across all the packs that maybe are interdependent by nature because they all depend on the origin code?
Absolutely. Great question. And this is top of mind actually at Gusto at the moment. So our core models, some people call them God models or spaghetti models or something like that. So those models tend to grow very, very large, and they tend to be sort of de facto entry point into a lot of APIs. You say, so for Gusto, it's company and employee mostly. User too, but actually company and employee are the biggest ones. So let's say company, and maybe we have a method like company dot payroll processed or something, making that up. Well, we also have company dot, benefits process and every other API in the system. And people keep adding columns to it. And it becomes a central point of entanglement where, as you said, everything depends on it and it depends on everything. So this, you can't extract that into an engine, because it depends on everything. It would be so hard. So we did something kind of maybe kind of silly. We pulled the company and employee models into a pack called Company Spaghetti Model. That's what the pack is called. And it's pretty illustrative. It says, hey, this is spaghetti. And the dependency list is basically empty, which means that people will see what's called a dependency violation if they add their domain into company. So basically, we're using this system to it's kind of like a Rubocop for preventing future entanglement, preventing future growth of this model. And what we've done is we started to actually burn down that list of dependency violations in company. And so far, we've removed probably like a dozen columns from our company model, a bunch of associations, a ton of methods. And our goal is that at Gusto, a company is a really simple concept, but it's these other systems that extends the idea of a company without necessarily affecting that core model, And then in essence, what that means is that everything depends on company, but we can set that long-term goal that company itself doesn't depend on anything.
Right.
So building on that, I just had a follow-up, like where do you start? Like, how do you start pulling pieces of that off in meaningful chunks, right? Like, if you have like this specific company thing that's shared across a few different things, like I imagine the naming of that is going to start to get strange too. Like, do you have a process for that? Is there something Packwork has that helps in figuring these things out? Or is that more of like just an analysis on your part?
So Packwork will tell you what company depends on with, various sort of caveats about what that means exactly. But how do you start pulling things out? I guess like slightly painfully, you look at a column and you say, hey, this definitely doesn't belong on the core company model. This belongs somewhere else. It belongs in a different domain. And from there are a couple of strategies you can use. One thing that you can use is you can say, okay, I'm going to build an API to access the data from that column and migrate everything to use that API rather than call company.myColumn. And then once everything is using that API, which sort of presents a facade of existing in a different pack, then you can start to swap out that implementation and have it point to, you point to a different model. You start double writing to that column and then you switch over the read and then you stop double writing, all while kind of trying to think about n+1s that you may be introducing by moving the column. But actually what we started with was we just looked at methods, just plain old methods, and we move those methods off of company. So instead of company.myMethod, we may have, my namespace : or my namespace dot something about company. You know what I mean? And so it still might actually ask company for that information, but we begin to move that API off of company, kind of allowing us to start to swap that implementation out.
Yeah, you're inverting the dependency so that you have
Exactly.
an interface that you can call instead of, and this is spelled out again in clean architecture, but you invert the dependency so that your graph isn't cyclical anymore.
Exactly. And I just want to call out that sometimes doing this has no business value. Sometimes doing it has no clear business value. But take company, for example. We have a whole team, as you can imagine, that wants to focus on bringing more people into Gusto. And, they want to make it easier for people to sign up. But when you have a large spaghetti model that people keep adding to, every time you add a new you add a new column, you add a new validation, trying to create that model becomes more challenging, not only for end users who may have to specify more information in order to become part of the platform, but for users who are doing test setup, and they need to create a company. Now, oh my gosh, I have to create the universe just to test my feature. So yeah, I don't know where I was going with that, but yeah.
No, it makes sense, right? Because at the end of the day, what you're looking at is not just the cyclical dependencies and how many of those you have, but it's also the complexity of the API surface between modules or between packs. And so the more you have to do, the more work you have to do, the more specification you have to meet, the harder it is. And yeah, so the simpler you can keep it and the easier it is to keep track of this stuff, and the more that you can extract a lot of that dependency layer out to a module or even a mix in that gives people a way of getting the information they need without depending directly on the model. It allows you to redirect a lot of that stuff and keep your code a lot simpler. And anyway, it pays off, like you said, not just for the coder who, at this point, I know I need these 4 things out of the company module or the company pack, but also for the, like you said, the end user who now has a higher constraint on what they can do, and it makes it more rigid. And you want elastic code that you can, flex and play with a little bit. And the heavier you put that burden, the harder it is to change. And that's ultimately painful when it comes to writing code, because if you change it and you mess up with the specification and you have multiple things depending on it instead of depending on that shim layer, that module that you've created, you start having more issues, and it makes the rest of your code more rigid. And so that's the game you're playing, is you're restricting that API surface by inverting the dependency and putting that module out there, and then you're cleaning up all your code because you only have to care about those handful of things and not putting those constraints and that rigidity into the next module or the next pack over that has to depend on your company. And then you can, like you said, you can start teasing some of these other pieces out, and hopefully eventually your dependency graph will eliminate a lot of the cycles that you have, and it'll simplify the interface to the company pack to the point where it's just something that you deal with on a regular basis, and you don't have the major issues that you're talking about.
You got it. It's something we're still working on, something we're still learning a lot about. And I think it's part of the evolution of a system. I think that if someone sees their core models growing and growing larger and larger, that isn't necessarily something they need to fret about immediately, because, scrappiness or trade-offs about design they're trade-offs, and if moving faster by, not only maybe do we want to not always focus on the interface in the beginning, but we don't necessarily know the boundaries. We don't necessarily know the domains when we're first learning about them. When a startup or even a large org is learning about their customers' needs, they don't have that shape in their head of what the model is that fits those needs. So we just sort of throw it together. We're like, this works, this solves the problem. But then after a while, we're like, oh gosh, this whole thing kind of feels like a Rube Goldberg machine. The domino hits the lighter, which burns the string, and the ping pong ball falls.
Yeah.
And so then, starting to back up and say, let's put some structure on this. So that's kind of what we're on about.
So I want to get into implementation a little bit. So let's say that I've identified something that I want to move into a pack. How do I use Packwork to do it?
Yeah. So let's see. First thing I want to plug, if I may, is that there is a community Slack server for questions and help and talking about all this stuff. And I'm not sure if we can put something like that in the show notes.
Definitely.
Awesome. I also have a link here, tinyurl.com/Ruby Slack. So I hope that works by the time this goes out still. Folks want to try that. And that's just very welcoming community of industry professionals and people interested in Ruby and Rails modularity. So yeah, great place to ask questions. Now back to your question, implementation. So Packwork itself doesn't give many tools to create a pack or to move files into packs. It gives you a declarative specification for defining a pack, but yeah, it doesn't give you the tools. So we have open sourced a lot of our tool chain around this. That's kind of all in the github.com/Ruby@scale is the org where all this stuff is, and that's linked in the blog post too. So there's this gem we open source called use packs, where, as the name suggests, all that using packs, and it exposes a CLI bin/packs, and it has a kind of fancy interactive thing going on, which I think is kind of nifty. So you type bin packs, and then it gives you, so after you've set up packs, I should back up. You have to first set up packs Rails. And what packs Rails does is that it tells Rails to add packs to the autoload paths for Rails. So basically, as long as you're following the structure specified in the README, you won't have to mess around too much with Rails config in order to get things to load the way you want. So that's the first step. And then what bin packs does, what use packs, is it lets you create a pack. You give it a name, it creates a folder with a package YAML. There's a move function, which is kind of a fancy Rails informed utility for file, .move, basically. It moves the file, it moves its spec file, it updates references in Rubocop to do so you can move files without thinking about all the other stuff you have to do. It has a little bit of like a plugin system if your architecture has other things that are coupled to file structure and file location. But that's kind of all there is to it. You create a pack, which is just make dir, however you pronounce that. You create a directory and you move a file into it. And then Packwork, it being a static analysis tool, you run the Packwork tool, and it will basically do some AST magic and parsing of files to determine the relationship between the packs based on the code that's in those packs.
Nice. So are the packs then, because the way you're talking about it now, it sounds like a pack isn't necessarily then like an internal gem or something. It could just be a collection of code within your Rails app or your Ruby app that doesn't get loaded that way. It's just pulled in through load paths just like anything else.
That's right. And that's something that I really love about it, is that this whole system is, for all intents and purposes, it doesn't and shouldn't affect your runtime at all. Besides, of course, namespace changes that you may or may not make. But actually, when you move a file between packs, something that we love is that you don't have to change the namespace at all, which means, all that move really is just changing the auto-loaded portion of that path. But all of the references to the constants, constants, classes, or modules defined within the moved file, those can remain the same. It's the same definition, because the path doesn't become part of the namespace definition. If that's not to get too much into like the nitty gritty of auto loading and all that stuff in Rails, but
yeah, that's for another episode. Valentino, sure. I feel like I've been hogging the mic. Do you have stuff you want to jump in with?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about testing, because one of the biggest hopes that I have for like static analysis tools like this is that it doesn't take an hour or a half hour or whatever it may be to run the entire test suite for like a one file change, right? Like Do you start to see that using packs, or is there still the same kind of problem?
Okay, so yeah, a lot to unpack. No pun intended. Let's see. So first off, I should mention is that something cool with Pax Rails is that the test files are co-located next to the code they're testing. So you may have like Pax payments, app models, payroll, or not payments, app models, notcha entry. And then you have Pax payments spec models or whatever the path may be. So that's the first thing. And that's just kind of nice in a huge system for finding spec files, even though, you may have your own kind of hotkeys and stuff. But in terms of test speedups, so, every time just to get to the principles for a second, every time you run a test, you need to load all of the code that you depend on. So if your code is still entangled, even if it's in a pack, well, you still need to load that code. And that's something that Rails through Zeitwerk, the autoloader, will do for you automatically. It'll automatically. So if your code depends on the rest of your application and the application depends on everything, then you won't see any improvements. The improvements come when you begin to disentangle things and begin to manage that dependency graph and start to isolate something. At which point, in theory, the less code will load. And actually, in practice, we only run a subset of our tests in CI based on what's changed. So yes, short answer, I guess, is yes, that we do see some improvements there, but it's not immediate, and you really got to do all the hard work of going in there and isolating code.
So at what point do you get to where you can like safely have your CI run only specific tests that, because you're using static analysis so heavily in packs, right? Mm-hmm. Like that you could know the graph of, okay, well, we know this won't affect pretty much 90% of the entire application. So we don't need to run tests for 90% of our test space. Like, are you there? Like, how long did it take to get there if you are there?
We are definitely not there yet. There's still a lot of entangled code and it's not because of anything we've done right, or done wrong, excuse me. It's because I think of things we've done right. We're still alive as a business and doing really, really well because of the trade-offs we made and all the hard work everyone put in. But now we're facing different problems, and yeah, we're still pretty far from it, And there's a lot of work ahead of us to really isolate things and to make our dependency graph acyclic so we can really unlock the full potential of conditional builds.
So I guess my follow-up would be like, is there anything that you wish you had done that could set you up for a better place now? Like, is there anything you could do like retro, or like not retro, but like, preemptively to help make that transition better?
Sure. Well, so I first want to add a disclaimer that, hindsight's 2020. And perhaps if we went back and we did all the things I'm going to say, then we would have spent too much time on technical excellence and we wouldn't have, found product market fit. So that's my disclaimer. So take everything I say with a grain of salt. That being said, let's see. I think that probably would have pushed on keeping those, God models, the spaghetti models, keeping them lightweight and making sure that extensions of those concepts live in isolated modules from the get-go, and always kind of thinking, how easy will it be for me to completely delete this feature? Is it entangled within the existing system or is it well isolated? I think I would have, I would recommend going back, not necessarily spending a ton of time just doing whatever and then spending a long period of time with structural work and refactor work, but interleaving those activities, doing a little bit of, okay, I'm going to try to find that product market fit. Okay, I think I found something. I'm going to kind of come back, clean up this system and improve it, create the APIs I want, fix up the dependencies that I just kind of hacked together because I needed to make it work, and do that cleanup. I think so often we consider a project done when there's still a lot of cleanup, whether that be, oh, I have to stop double writing this column and drop the other one, or, so on and so forth. But really, like, making sure to commit to that cleanup, perhaps.
Makes sense. We're kind of getting toward the end of our time, and I need to prep for another call. So
sure,
I'm going to start heading us toward wrap up. But if people want to learn more about this or connect with you on the internet, where do they find you?
Yeah. So I'm not on too many of the social media things these days, but you can email me, alexevanczuk@gmail.com. I'm on that Slack server that I mentioned. And yeah, really encourage anyone to join. You can be of any experience level, beginner to expert. We'd love to have you. Fresh ideas are welcome. And yeah, that's about it.
All right, good deal. Now, before we do picks, we added a segment where we talk about what we're working on these days. So, Valentino, what are you working on that people should know about?
Yeah, pretty much the same thing. I am working on a AI system for Doximity called Docs GPT that basically lets doctors take advantage of the Chat GPT large language model in a healthcare context. And it's just so much fun learning, new ways to adapt AI into it and retrofit it into a business. It's just so much fun and so much potential there. So I've been working heavy in that.
So what I'm working on, I've kind of talked about all the things I've got going on. I figured out I was overextending myself, so I've cut way back, and I'm just going to focus on one thing. And so I'm just going to run through what it looks like. So essentially, when I was talking to my business coach, and he mentioned, like I said, that I was doing too much. And so he got me to narrow things down. So effectively, I'm going to be doing video series like Rails Casts or Drifting Ruby. And I'm getting ready to launch it. I found a platform too, so that'll be in my picks that I'm going to run it on. But yeah, I want to do things a little bit different from the way that I've seen them done with other folks in their video series. I am going to do at least 2 videos a week like Railscast did, right? One will be free, one will be paid. But the thing I'm going to add on top of it is I want to do a monthly call with the people who are signed up. So, we'll just get on. I'll do a 10, 15-minute presentation on something. I'll let people help me decide what that is if you're signed up, and then we'll do the call. I'm also going to be doing it. So I'm doing one on Ruby or Rails, or I might do 2. I might do one on Ruby stuff that's not Rails and one that's Ruby or one that's Rails. But I'm also doing one on JavaScript. I'm doing one on dev tools. So I'm thinking like Docker, Visual Studio Code, Git, that kind of stuff. And then I'm doing one on dev careers, right? So I'm going to start the 4 of them. And then if you want to buy the overarching membership, that's going to be the full membership. And full members, they're also going to get a bonus call every month. And occasionally I'm going to put out smaller courses and they'll just get access to those. And then when I do get back around to that other stuff, like the conferences or whatever, then you'll get first crack at buying the best seats, basically. So if you're interested in that, go to topenddevs.com, click on the sign up link. If you've already signed up for something in the past, you'll get an email from me telling you how to move to the new system. And if you haven't, or if you have just a free account, then I'll let you know how to get any freebies that you should have had access to. But from there, yeah, we're just going to pull it ahead. So keep an eye out for that. I've already started recording videos. And so, yeah, that's what I'm working on right now. Alex, what are you working on that people should know about?
Oh, go ahead. Thank you, Dave, for sharing that. Sound pretty busy. So what am I working on? Mostly a lot of this stuff. What I found, I've just been kind of constantly humbled by how difficult some of this work is, and trying to figure out how to kind of put the right pieces in place so we can scale our monolith and give people the tools. At this immediate time, we are trying to get all of our code and our code base to be owned by a team. We, as you can imagine, people make changes to code and they leave, and then code is left without an owner. So we are using this open source tool, Code Ownership, to make sure that all code is owned, and then kind of start to try to give kind of standardize on some metrics that teams can use to assess the kind of ongoing stability and operational kind of capabilities of the product. So kind of stuff like that.
All right, well, let's do some picks. Valentino, what do you have in the way of picks?
So I've been following the Ruby 30th event on Twitter, and it's all in Japanese, the live event. So I waited, and now it's on YouTube, and you can kind of auto translate closed captions, which is nice. So I've been going back and watching that. It's kind of wild to see all of the responses from the Ruby community on there. So that's my pick for today.
Awesome. I've got a whole bunch of picks I'm going to throw out, so I'm going to go fast. The first one is I'm going to pick a game called The Quacks of Quedlinburg. I always pick a board game at the beginning. Quacks of Quedlinburg, effectively you have a potion you're trying to brew, and you draw ingredients out of a bag and you place them in your cauldron, and you're trying to score the highest you can without your potion exploding. And your potion explodes if you get too many white ingredients in your potion, is the way that it goes. So you pull out a green one, you put it down. You pull out a red one, you put it down. You pull out a and then they're all numbered, and you move up the track. And then you get points. You get more bonuses if you don't explode your potion than if you do. You can still win if you explode some of your potions, but it's a little bit harder. And so you're getting money to buy more ingredients. You get victory points. Anyway, it's great. I really enjoyed it. You also get gems that look like rubies, which makes me happy. That you can buy bonuses with. So anyway, Board Game Geek ranks it at a 1.99. So it's right in there at the casual gamer level. You don't have to be a hardcore board game nut like I am to enjoy the game and not feel overwhelmed. Some of the other games I've picked on here, it's like if you're not a hardcore gamer, you're gonna read the rule book and say nope. But anyway, this one is definitely in the realm of the casual gamer, and it's a lot of fun. We played it while we were down in St. George. My wife and I got away with my father-in-law and my sister-in-law and her husband, and we just walked through houses and played games. It was a ton of fun, and sat in the hot tub. So a few other picks. I told you I was going to talk about the platform I'm using for the courses. Now, I made the mistake of thinking a course platform, I can build that. And it turns out that I can build that, but it's going to take me a whole lot more time and not really add a ton of value. And so I want to start getting the content out. So I figured out that the CRM I've been using to reach out to sponsors, and that we're moving all of our podcast guest outreach to, also has a membership suite to it. And so I cracked that open. I had to pay a little extra to turn it on. But yeah, so what I've been using is Pipeline Pro. You can get a lifetime license to kind of the basic CRM, and then they have marketing and automation add-on, which costs like $100 a month, and then the membership add-on, which is like $50 a month. And so I am still paying a monthly fee for it, but unlike some of the other systems I've used, there's no limit to how much I can put into it. So I can put as many memberships in as I want, as many of these other things in as I want. And then you can just sign into the portal and you get access to all of the courses all of the series and everything else that's involved. So if you sign in and you sign up for the Rails clips is what I called it. I'm trying to find another name for the Ruby one. I was going to do Ruby clips, but somebody already owns the domain, and it's kind of a not safe for work kind of site. So
Gotcha.
anyway, so I'm going to name it something else. But anyway, because I kind of do want to do 2 series, but you'll get in and it'll show you all of the lessons that I've done, or all the tutorials, whatever I decide to call them. It'll show you the meetups, and then it'll show you any other resources that we put out. Because I also want to put together some kind of homework or assignment or something, and give people the opportunity to come back and say, hey, I built the thing that Chuck said to build, and here's my example, and then we give feedback on the code. So anyway, so I really like it. It's really simple to use and is pretty straightforward. And then I don't have to go pay $150 a month to Teachable or something in order to use it. It's just, it's there, and I can use it the way I want. So overall, I've been really, really happy with Pipeline Pro, just for all the stuff that I'm doing with it. If you're going to go set up a system like this, a friend of mine has set his up, and he doesn't need all the fancy CRM features. He's using a system called Kartra with a K, Kartra. So that's another one you may want to look at if you're looking to do courses and stuff like that. So anyway, those are my picks. Oh, one other pick. I watched the last episode of 1923. Of course, they kind of leave you on a cliffhanger. I was hoping they'd wrap the story up like they did 1883, but they didn't. But anyway, I really enjoyed that, so I'm going to pick that as well. All right, Alex, what are your picks?
All right, let's see what I got. So I don't have much in the way of software stuff, but see other sorts of media. I don't know if anyone's into gardening, but living in Vermont, we like to garden a lot, and I listen to a lot of this podcast called the Joe Gardener podcast. And yeah, he gives you the lowdown on everything you need to know around soil health and plants, maintenance and care throughout the seasons. That's really important to us and to me personally, is those sorts of ideas. And gosh, it feels great to grow and eat some of your own food. I love that feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the only other one, I just got a notification on my phone that there's a new season of Mandalorian out. I saw that Star Wars poster behind you, Charles. So
oh yeah,
I'm pretty excited about that because I really enjoyed the other seasons.
Yeah, that one was pretty good. I didn't realize. I think I saw something about it on Twitter, but I didn't realize that they were tweeting about new season being out. So that's exciting. All right, well, we're gonna go ahead and wrap it up. Thanks for coming. This was awesome. And until next time, folks, Max out.